The lock on the door clicked with the finality of a coffin lid shutting. 18 years of his life were on the other side of that wood, and on this side, there was only the biting November air and a single burlap sack at his feet. Inside it were a wool blanket, a small block of cheese, his father's whetstone, and a worn book on basic engineering his mother had given him long ago. His German shepherd, Rook, pressed a wet nose into his cold hand, the dog's low whine the only sound of protest in a world that had gone silent. From behind the door, his stepmother's voice was sharp and brittle, like ice cracking underfoot. "Your father's gone, Finn. This house is mine now. There's no room for a stray and his mutt." He hadn't argued. Arguing with Martha was like trying to reason with a rock slide. Since his father's passing from fever 2 months prior, she had moved with a chilling efficiency, erasing every trace of her husband and his first family. Finn, with his quiet intensity and his father's practical hands, was the last and most inconvenient piece to be discarded. He looked back at the small, windswept town of Port Blossom, its wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth. No one came out. They'd heard the shouting. They'd seen him pushed onto the porch. And they'd all turned back to their own hearths, their own lives, conveniently deaf and blind. Shame burned hotter than the cold. He shouldered the sack, the meager weight of his entire existence, and gave a soft whistle for Rook. The dog fell into step beside him, a silent, loyal shadow. They walked away from the only home he had ever known, not toward the inland trails where winter was already setting its teeth, but toward the coast, toward the endless, grey expanse of the sea. There was a story, a half-forgotten tale his father used to tell, of a stone tower on the farthest point of the Cape, abandoned by the shipping guilds decades ago. A lighthouse. It was a fool's hope, a child's fantasy. But it was the only direction that wasn't a dead end. The first night was a lesson in humility, taught by the unforgiving curriculum of the cold. Finn and Rook found a shallow overhang in the seaside cliffs, a meager scoop of rock that did little to blunt the wind's edge. He wrapped the single wool blanket around them both, the dog's body a furnace of living warmth against his own shivering frame. Sleep came in brief, fitful bursts, punctuated by the roar of the surf and the gnawing anxiety of what the dawn would bring. He ate a third of the cheese, rationing it with a discipline born of sudden necessity, sharing a small piece with Rook. The dog ate it gently from his numb fingers, his intelligent eyes never leaving Finn's face, offering a companionship that felt more substantial than any wall or roof. When the sun rose, it was a pale, watery disk that offered no real warmth, only enough light to illuminate the bleakness of their path. They followed the curve of the coastline, a desolate ribbon of sand and stone separating the churning sea from the gorse-choked land. The walk was a grueling meditation. Every step was a conscious act of defiance against the despair that threatened to settle in his bones. He focused on the details, the way the sand shifted under his worn boots, the cry of a gull circling overhead, the steady, panting presence of Rook at his heel. His mind kept returning to the lighthouse. Was it real? And if it was, what would be left of it? A ruin, most likely. A hollowed-out shell filled with seawater and nesting birds. But it was made of stone. His father, a man who understood stone better than he understood people, had always said that stone endures. It was that single thought, the endurance of stone, that he clung to as the hours wore on. Late in the afternoon, when the light had begun to fade and a new, deeper cold was creeping in, he saw it. A smudge of grey against a grey sky, rising from the tip of the desolate cape. A solitary finger of rock, pointing defiantly at the heavens. The lighthouse. It was real. The sight of it sent a jolt of adrenaline through his exhausted body, a fragile spark of hope in the vast, cold emptiness. He had to scramble over a treacherous spit of rock slick with sea spray and algae, the tide greedily sucking at the crevices around his feet. Rook, more agile, bounded ahead, barking once as he reached the solid ground at the base of the tower. The lighthouse was larger up close, a monument of weathered granite that seemed to have grown from the bedrock itself. The heavy iron door was gone, likely salvaged for scrap years ago, leaving a dark, gaping maw. Wind howled through it, a mournful, hollow sound. Finn hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, Rook close behind him. The air was thick with the smell of salt, damp stone, and decay. Light filtered down from the empty lantern room at the very top, illuminating a vast, circular chamber. A graceful spiral staircase of cast iron, miraculously intact though coated in a filigree of rust, clung to the curved wall, ascending into the gloom. The floor was solid stone, swept clean in places by the ceaseless wind. It was a shell, just as he'd feared, but it was a magnificent one. The walls were 3 feet thick, a formidable barrier against the elements. This was a place built to withstand the worst the ocean could throw at it. He ran a hand over the cold, rough-hewn granite. It was solid, unyielding. A fortress. While he was inspecting the walls, Rook began sniffing intently at a section of the floor near the base of the stairs, pawing at the stone. Finn knelt and saw a heavy iron ring set flush with the floor. With a grunt of effort, he heaved it up, revealing a dark shaft and the glint of water below. A cistern. He lowered a small tin cup he found in a corner, tied to a length of frayed rope, and brought it up. The water was brackish, but it was water. It could be boiled, filtered. It was life. A small, fierce grin touched Finn's lips for the first time in days. This was a start. A real, tangible start. He had shelter from the wind and a source of water. Now, he just had to solve the most pressing problem of all, the soul-stealing cold. Warmth was the gear around which all other aspects of survival would turn. Without a reliable source of heat, the dampness would seep into his bones, sickness would follow, and this stone tower would become his tomb. A simple open fire in the center of the chamber was out of the question. The smoke would have nowhere to go but up, filling the entire structure, choking him out. He needed to control the fire, to channel its heat and direct its smoke. He needed a fireplace. His father's voice echoed in his memory, lectures delivered over half-finished walls and stacks of stone. Fire's a living thing, son. It needs to breathe. A good flue draws, it pulls the smoke up and away, and it throws the heat out where you need it. Finn walked the perimeter of the ground floor chamber again and again, his eyes tracing the elegant curve of the wall. He needed a spot where he could build a hearth and a chimney that could be vented to the outside without compromising the tower's structural integrity. He found the ideal location on the leeward side of the tower, where a series of smaller, less integral stones were set into the wall. It would be grueling work to remove them, but it was possible. He spent the next 2 days gathering materials, a methodical, back-breaking process that left his muscles screaming in protest. He hauled flat, heavy stones from the storm-tossed beach, selecting them for their shape and stability, stacking them carefully inside the tower. He found a vein of dense, grey clay in the bank of a small creek a half-mile inland, digging it out with his bare hands and a sharpened piece of driftwood, packing it into his sack and lugging it back. He knew from his father that pure clay would crack as it dried. It needed a temper. He mixed it with sand from the cove, adding just enough water from the cistern to create a thick, workable mortar. Rook watched his every move, a silent, attentive partner in this desperate act of engineering, occasionally nudging his hand as if to offer encouragement. The pile of stones grew, the mound of clay mortar sat ready. He had the raw components. Now came the true test, turning them into something that could hold back the winter. The first attempt was a catastrophic failure. He laid the hearth stones, built up the firebox, and carefully constructed the throat of the chimney, tapering it just as he thought his father had described. After 2 days of painstaking work, his hands raw and his back aching, he finally chiseled the last opening through the thick lighthouse wall for the flue. With trembling hands, he lit a small bundle of dried grass and driftwood inside the newly built hearth. A plume of thick, acrid smoke billowed out, not up the chimney, but directly into the chamber. It poured into the room, stinging his eyes and catching in his throat. Within minutes, he was forced out of the lighthouse, coughing and gasping for air. Rook whined, nudging him with concern. Defeat felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. He had wasted time, energy, and precious hope. For a full hour, he sat on the cold rocks outside, watching the smoke slowly seep from the doorway, feeling the familiar sting of failure. But then, his father's words came back to him again. "You don't learn from the getting it right, son. You learn from the getting it wrong." He went back inside, his eyes streaming, and studied the smoke-stained stones. The angle was wrong. The opening of the flue was too large, creating a cold plug of air that the weak heat from the kindling couldn't push out. It wasn't drawing, it was choking. With a deep sigh of resignation, he began the arduous task of dismantling the top half of his creation, stone by painful stone. This time, he worked more slowly, more deliberately. He narrowed the flue, changing the angle of the smoke shelf inside the chimney to create a better draft. He rebuilt the firebox, making it shallower to push more heat out into the room rather than straight up. He remixed his clay mortar, getting the consistency just right. When he was finally ready to test it again, the sun was setting. He lit the kindling with a sense of dread. A wisp of smoke curled from the wood, hesitated for a second, and then, as if making a decision, it streamed upwards, a clean, thin ribbon drawn perfectly up the flue and out into the evening air. A small, steady flame took hold, casting a warm, flickering orange light across the stone walls. Finn sank to the floor, the first real wave of relief washing over him. It was more than just a fire. It was a victory. It was warmth. It was life. With the hearth providing a steady, reliable source of warmth, the stone tower began to transform from a desolate shelter into a home. The oppressive dampness receded, replaced by a dry, radiant heat that permeated the very granite of the walls. Finn methodically sealed the worst of the drafts in the window openings with tightly packed seaweed and clay, a trick he'd observed in the construction of old fishing shacks along the coast. He dragged driftwood up from the beach, building a crude but sturdy table, a stool, and a raised platform for his bed, getting his blanket off the cold stone floor. Life fell into a rhythm dictated by the tides and the light. Mornings were for gathering firewood and checking the simple snare lines he'd set for rabbits in the gorse. Afternoons were for improving his dwelling, mending his clothes, or simply sitting by the fire, reading the engineering book by the flickering light. He learned the coastline secrets, which pools held fish after the tide went out, where the best mussels clung to the rocks, and which seabirds' eggs were edible. One day, while scavenging along a stretch of beach several miles south, he came across a small shack built from driftwood and salvaged timbers, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. An old man with a face as weathered as a sea cliff sat outside, mending a fishing net. His name was Abel. He was a man of few words, and he offered no pity, only a shrewd assessment. He saw Finn's worn boots and the lean, hard set of his jaw. "You're the boy from the tower," Abel stated, not asked. Finn nodded. That first meeting led to a silent compact of mutual benefit. Finn, with his nimbler fingers and better eyesight, was adept at mending Abel's nets. In return, Abel would leave a portion of his catch, a fat cod or a string of mackerel, on a flat rock halfway between the shack and the lighthouse. Abel also imparted wisdom in short, gruff sentences. He taught Finn how to read the weather in the clouds, how to smoke fish to preserve it for winter, and confirmed that boiling the cistern water with a hot rock dropped into the bucket was the surest way to make it safe. It wasn't friendship, not in the traditional sense. It was a relationship built on the solid bedrock of practical exchange and quiet, earned respect, which to Finn felt far more valuable. The weeks turned into months. Autumn bled into the grey stillness of early winter. Finn grew leaner but stronger, his body hardened by the constant labor, his mind sharpened by the daily challenges of survival. He was no longer just surviving, he was living, carving out a stable existence from the edge of the world. News of his unlikely survival trickled back to Port Blossom. Abel, on his rare trips to town for salt and flour, would field the questions. The townspeople's reactions were a mix of disbelief, scorn, and a grudging, unspoken respect. Martha, he heard, told anyone who would listen that the boy was feral and had likely met a bad end. But others were curious. The general store owner, a practical man named Mr. Davies, was more interested in the facts. "He's alive then?" "And warm," he asked Abel one day. "He's got a fire," Abel grunted in reply, which in his sparse vocabulary was a high compliment. Finn cared little for their opinions. Their world felt a lifetime away. His world was the cry of the gulls, the roar of the surf, the steady warmth of his hearth, and the loyal presence of Rook at his side. Then, one afternoon, Mr. Davies himself made the arduous trek out to the lighthouse. He looked out of place in his town coat, his face flushed from the wind and the walk. He carried a heavy sack. "The barometer," Mr. Davies said without preamble, his voice strained. "It's fallen lower than I've ever seen. Lower than my father ever saw. Abel says a storm is coming. Not just a storm, a monster. The kind that scours the land clean." He looked at the solid stone walls of the lighthouse, then back toward the low-lying spit of sand where Port Blossom sat, vulnerable and exposed. "Our houses are wood and nails, Finn. They won't survive the surge the old-timers talk about. We've nowhere to go." He set the sack down. It was filled with flour, salted pork, and coffee. "This is for you," he said. "A trade." "For what?" "I'm not yet sure." Finn understood the unspoken question. Mr. Davies wasn't just bringing a warning, he was taking a measure of the place, and of the young man who had tamed it. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with an eerie, expectant silence. The sky turned a bruised purple-grey, and the sea, which had been agitated for days, grew unnaturally calm and flat, its surface like dark, oiled glass. The air became heavy, thick, and difficult to breathe. Abel had stopped by the day before, his face grim. "This is the one," he'd said, his voice low. "The kind they tell stories about. Don't you go outside for nothing." Not for nothing he had secured his own small shack as best he could and retreated inland to a cave he knew of. Finn had spent the last 2 days hauling a massive pile of firewood inside, filling the cistern to the brim, and checking every seal around the windows. He and Rook were as ready as they could be. Then the wind came. It started as a low moan that grew steadily into a shrieking, physical force that made the thick granite walls around him hum like a tuning fork. Rain followed, not in drops, but in horizontal sheets that hammered against the tower. Through the small, sealed windows, Finn watched the sea rise with terrifying speed. The calm was a lie, a predator's stillness before the strike. Now, the ocean was an enraged beast, throwing colossal waves against the rocks at the base of the lighthouse, the spray reaching halfway up the tower. He could no longer distinguish the sea from the sky, it was all a churning, grey chaos. As darkness fell, he lit a few extra tallow lamps he'd made, their small flames a comfort against the raging fury outside. He stoked the fire in his hearth, the chimney drawing the wind's howl down into a deep, resonant roar. He and Rook sat before it, the dog's head resting on his knee, both of them watching the flames. He could just make out the distant lights of Port Blossom, small and fragile against the immense darkness. Then, he saw them begin to flicker. One went out. Then another. Then a whole section vanished. He imagined the water, cold and black, surging through the streets, tearing at the foundations of the wooden houses, swallowing everything. He thought of the people there. The ones who had watched him leave, the ones who had scorned him. He thought of Martha. The choice was brutally simple. He could stay here, safe and warm in his stone fortress, and let the storm deliver a cold, indifferent justice. Or he could act. His father had never been a man for grand gestures, but he had lived by a simple code: you help when you can. He looked at the great, empty lantern room at the top of the stairs. It gave him an idea. With a new sense of purpose, he began hauling his largest, driest logs up the winding iron staircase. Climbing the spiral stairs with armfuls of heavy driftwood was a treacherous, exhausting task. The wind shrieked through the empty lantern housing at the top, a vortex of raw power that threatened to tear the very air from his lungs. Rook whined anxiously at the bottom of the stairs, unwilling to follow him into that high, exposed place. Finn worked with a desperate urgency, stacking the logs in the center of the iron and stone platform where the great lens had once Saturday. He used his remaining tallow and a bundle of oil-soaked rags to start the blaze. For a terrifying moment, the wind nearly extinguished his efforts, but then a log caught, and another, and soon a massive bonfire roared to life, a column of flame and smoke clawing at the storm-racked sky. It wasn't a focus beam, but it was a beacon. A raw, primal signal of fire and hope against the maelstrom. He made his way back down to the relative calm of his living chamber and waited, his heart pounding. An hour passed, then 2. He began to fear he was too late, that the fire was a futile gesture against the overwhelming power of the storm. Then, a hammering sound at the door, barely audible over the wind. He unbarred the heavy plank door he'd fashioned and was nearly thrown back by the force of the gale. A small group of people stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and shivering with cold and terror. It was Mr. Davies, his wife, and a few of their neighbors. "We saw the light," Davies gasped, his face a mask of disbelief and gratitude. "We didn't think. We just came," Finn simply nodded, pointing them toward the fire. Before long, more came. They arrived in small, battered groups, guided by the improbable fire in the sky. They were fishermen, merchants, the town blacksmith, the very people who had stood by silently as he was cast out. Finally, a last, bedraggled group appeared, and among them was Martha. She looked smaller, stripped of her pride and anger, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She wouldn't meet his gaze. There were no grand speeches, no accusations or recriminations. The storm raging outside rendered all of that meaningless. Finn worked methodically, handing out his spare blankets, portioning out smoked fish and the bread he'd baked, showing them where the driest spots on the floor were. His quiet, calm competence was an anchor in their chaos. He was no longer the outcast boy, he was the keeper of the flame, the master of the stone tower that was now their only sanctuary. For 2 full days and nights, the storm battered the lighthouse. Inside, a strange, temporary community formed. The 30 or so survivors from Port Blossom huddled together, their social standings and old grievances washed away by the common threat. Finn moved among them, a quiet, efficient presence. He rationed his carefully gathered supplies, ensuring everyone had something to eat. He kept the fire in the hearth burning steadily, a constant source of warmth and psychological comfort. He boiled water from the cistern, dispensing it to the thirsty. He did not speak much, letting his actions communicate everything that needed to be said. People who had once looked at him with pity or contempt now watched him with a dawning sense of awe. They saw not a feral boy, but a capable young man who had single-handedly built a life in a place they had all considered a ruin. They saw the neat stack of firewood, the well-built fireplace that drew smoke perfectly, the simple but functional furniture. They saw the evidence of relentless work, ingenuity, and foresight. Martha sat apart from the others, wrapped in one of Finn's blankets, her face a study in complex emotions. She watched him tend to a fisherman's injured hand, his touch gentle and sure. She saw him share his own small meal with Rook. Shame was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The house she had prized so highly was likely a pile of splintered wood by now, while the boy she had thrown out was the sole reason she was still alive. On the second night, she approached him as he stood near the fire. "Finn," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. The words caught in her throat. An apology felt hollow, inadequate in the face of what he had done. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod, as if to say the words weren't necessary. He turned back to the fire, adding another log to the flames. The gesture was not one of forgiveness, perhaps, but of acceptance. It was a silent acknowledgement that the past was done, and the only thing that mattered now was surviving the present. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and inside the stone tower, there was only the shared, fragile warmth of survival. When the dawn of the third day broke, it was to an almost shocking silence. The wind had died, and the sea had retreated, leaving behind a world remade by its fury. Port Blossom was gone. Where the town had stood, there was now a wasteland of debris, splintered lumber, and sand. Only the foundations of a few buildings remained. The devastation was absolute. The townspeople emerged from the lighthouse, blinking in the pale sunlight, their faces etched with shock and grief. But they were alive. Every single one of them who had made it to the tower had survived. As they began the grim task of salvaging what they could from the wreckage, a new social order quietly emerged. It was not based on wealth or name, but on practical ability. And at its center was Finn. He showed them how to purify water, how to build temporary shelters from the debris that was strong enough to withstand the afterstorms. His knowledge, once a source of suspicion, was now their most valuable resource. Martha worked alongside the others, her hands, once soft, becoming calloused from hauling wood and clearing rubble. She never spoke of the past again, but her actions were a form of penance. She made sure Finn's supplies were replenished first, that he always had help when he needed it. A few weeks later, Mr. Davies and a council of the survivors approached Finn at the lighthouse. "We're going to rebuild," Davies said, "but on higher ground this time. And we want the lighthouse to be part of it. The heart of it. We want you to be its official keeper. To maintain it as a permanent storm shelter, a beacon for this community." Finn looked out at the sea, at the horizon that had once seemed like the end of the world. He thought of the cold night he had arrived, a boy with nothing but a dog and a sack. The rejection that was meant to destroy him had instead placed him in the one spot on the entire coast that could endure. It had forced him to learn, to build, to become the person he was now. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Rook pressed against his leg, a warm and steady presence. The lighthouse was no longer his refuge from the world, it was his connection to it. It stood not as a monument to his isolation, but as a testament to the enduring power of a single, stubborn flame against the dark.